Hello and welcome back to another episode of On the Beaten Track. I'm your host, Rihanna. When I decided in which order I should do the people that came up and I learned about during the research and reading of Steve Biko's story, in my brain I had an order that made sense. And now I can't really think of it. I was just like, must be Peter Jones after. And then I was like, okay, do I start with the leadership of SASO? Do I start with Black consciousness? And somehow I think I did them opposite way around. But there's a middle bunch of people that I can't explain. There's an order that made sense in my brain at some stage. And maybe when I'm done, it'll make sense to you and me too. Thank you so much for returning again for another one of our episodes. I am always so grateful. Please, before we start the episode, please remember to subscribe. I looked at the stats last night and about 95% of you on YouTube specifically are not subscribed, but are watching week on week. So please remember to subscribe, like the video, and leave a comment if possible. I have been seeing a lot of views on Apple Podcast. Thank you so much. For some reason, when I go into the information to kind of track what's going on, the data's just not showing up. I will at some stage figure it out. But at the moment, I'm just seeing the views coming through. So thank you and welcome everybody that I see from Vietnam, Bangladesh, all these locations, and the United States. Thank you so much for joining in. And I hope you're enjoying our stories, our South African stories. Today, we are going to look at the life of Barney Pityana. Barney Pityana is probably the first person that I will be doing who is still alive. Is it? Is it? Feel like it is. Yeah. We'll talk about this activist, priest, plot twist, and human rights champion. When people tell the story of Black consciousness movement in South Africa, they tell it understandably, inevitably through the life of Steve Biko. That's where we started this, right? Biko was extraordinary. I don't know how many times I'm going to say that. And then just to hear about Peter Jones last week. He's extraordinary. He was murdered by the state when he was 30 years old, which gives his story a terrible completeness. His face is on murals and book covers. The loss of a human of such great stature is really felt. His words are quoted in Parliament, and he's become a shorthand for an entire era of existence. But we all know movements are never built by one person. Every time we talk about the creation of movement, when we talk about the coming together of the ANC, when we talk about the guys that were, all these trials, there's normally 4, 5, 6 of them, all of them all together. Movements are never built by one person. They are built by teams, by people who work alongside the visible leader, who organize the machinery, who hold things together when the pressure is at its worst, who carry the work forward when the central figure is silenced or is gone. And that is essentially what happened to a lot of individuals during this time. Barney Pityana was that person for the Black consciousness movement. He was Biko's most important ally, the first president of SASO, a co-architect of the philosophy that changed South Africa's political landscape, and one of the people who paid a heavy personal price for that work through detention, banning, and forced exile. He was also, and this is what makes his life so unusual and so worth examining, a priest, a theologian, a human rights commissioner, a vice-chancellor, a political party founder, and a man who continued to speak truth to power long after the apartheid system who tried to crush him was gone. I always wonder why a lot of these guys don't use their first name, because it's so nice. It's the easiness of the name. People can say it, man. It's like with my surname. People mangle it in more times than they don't. But they learn because I tell them how to say it properly. Okay, so his full name is Nyameko Barney Pityana. He was born on the 7th of August 1945 in Sinead in the Eastern Cape. Look at you, Sinead, making a surprise appearance. He's still alive, and his story, which runs from missionary boarding school in the 60s through chairing the National Lotteries Commission at the age of 76, is one of the most extraordinary in modern South African history. Let's begin at that. We've spoken about so many times how the Eastern Cape in the mid-20th century was something of a nursery of South African liberation politics. The region produced a remarkable number of people who would go on to define the country's anti-apartheid movement, and Barney Pityana was one of them. He was an exceptional student, exceptional enough as a child to win the Andrew Smith Scholarship, a competitive award that gave him access to Lovedale. Lovedale's back. Lovedale in Alice in the Eastern Cape. Small town, Eastern Cape coming through for the win. As mentioned before, this was a Scottish-run missionary institution with a long tradition of producing graduates who went on to significant careers in public life. It was, by the standards of Black education under apartheid, unusually well-resourced and unusually progressive. Thanks, Scotland. It was at Lovedale that Pityana first encountered organized political activity. He joined the African National Congress Youth League, the youth wing of the organization that had been the dominant force in Black South African politics before the ANC was banned in 1960. Also, he got his first taste of what happened when you pushed back against the system. Eerily similar to Steve Biko. The relatively liberal atmosphere at Lovedale was changing in the 1960s. Afrikaans-speaking teachers were being introduced, carrying with them the culture of Bantu Education. And when I say the culture of Bantu Education, it's when we spoke about what they were trying to do with that education system. Was to deliberately provide Black students with inferior, limited education designed to prepare them for a life of manual labor and servitude, not for intellectual or professional achievement. Pityana pushed back loudly. He articulated forcefully and publicly the inequities of what was being imposed on him and his fellow students. In 1963, he was expelled from Lovedale for it. I'm having deja vu. He finished his matriculation at Newell High School in New Brighton, Port Elizabeth, and then in 1966, he enrolled at the University College of Fort Hare. Again, Fort Hare is a name that resonates through the entire history of African liberation politics. Nelson Mandela studied there, Robert Mugabe, Oliver Tambo. Fort Hare was, for Black South Africans, for students from across the continent, what Oxford, Cambridge might represent for the British establishment, the place where the leadership class went. And in the 1960s, it was also the place where political ideas were fermenting at a remarkable speed. Pityana became deeply involved in the university's Christian movements, the UCM, a radical organization that was introducing Black theology, liberation theology, and ideas about the connection between Christian faith and social justice to South African students. I think some countries need that today. Just the underlying faith, overwhelming majority to make the connection. That's what they need. He became the regional director of the UCM and the president of the Anglican Students Federation. These were not apolitical bodies. They were, in the late 1960s, incubators for the thinking that would become the Black consciousness movement. It was through that network that Barney Pityana met Steve Biko. So when they meet, Biko is studying medicine at the University of Natal's Black section in Durban and was already moving with clear purpose towards an idea that Black students needed to break away from the white-dominated National Union of South African Students and build their own organization. In NUSAS at as Pityana later recalled, white students treated the organization as, in his words, a nice friendly club, another game you played while at university. But for black students, the stakes were entirely different. Their lives and their futures were on the line. Biko went to Port Elizabeth to meet Pityana after a UCM conference in 1967. He put his idea directly. Pityana initially was not convinced. He had doubts that a racially exclusive student organization was the right approach. Biko argued him around, and once convinced, Pityana became, in the words of one historian, Biko's most important lieutenant. In August 1968, Biko invited Pityana and a group of students from the Durban network to Fort Hare for a campus mission. The visit led to student protest days later and to Pityana's second expulsion from a university. He was thrown out of Fort Hare in 1969. He was 23 years old. He had been expelled from 2 educational institutions for the crime of refusing to accept the terms on which apartheid South Africa wished to educate him. He was also now one of the architects of something entirely new. On the 1st of July 1969, South African Students' Organization, SASO, was officially launched at the University of the North. It was the formal birth of the Black consciousness movement as an organized force. Steve Biko was elected SASO's first president, and Biko did something strategically interesting. He deliberately kept a low profile in SASO's early stages. His reasoning was considered. He believed that the organization would be stronger if it wasn't entirely dependent on one visible leader, that it needed a robust second tier of leadership that would carry the work forward independently. He wanted to build the institution, not just the personality. At the first General Students' Council of SASO in July 1970, Barney Pityana was elected president of the organization. He was 24 years old, recently expelled from Fort Hare, and now leading one of the most consequential student movements in South African history. Pityana says Black consciousness is an attitude of mind and a way of life. The first step toward freedom is the liberation of the mind. Black consciousness was never about exclusion. It was about affirmation. This was not anti-white hatred. Biko and Pityana were both explicit about that. The goal was not to replace white supremacy with Black supremacy. The goal was a genuinely free, non-racial South Africa. But they insisted Black people could not get there on terms set by white people. They had to get there on their own terms, in their own voices, through their own power. Traveled the country with Biko, speaking at universities, organizing students, introducing their ideas to activists from the older liberation movements, the ANC, the PAC, and the Unity movement, many of whom had been recently released from prison or were operating under banning orders. He has written about those journeys with a vividness that tells you how alive everything felt. Long hours on the road, fierce debates, the building sense that something was taking root. That must have been exhilarating to be a part of. Must have been, especially when they saw how well it started moving through the universities. The communities that gathered around SASO in Durban was, by Pityana's own account, genuinely Black in the BCM sense. It included African, colored, and Indian students and activists, all living the principles they preach. Srini Moodley, Saths Cooper, which we will get to, and others were part of the inner circle. They socialized together, debated together, organized together. And they also spent long hours arguing fruitfully, productively with Rick Turner and his circle of Wages Commission students, the white philosopher whose existentialist framework was arriving at some of the same conclusions as Black consciousness from a different starting point. By 1972, SASO's influence had spread far beyond university campuses. A new body, the Black People's Convention, was established to give the broader community a political home. The movement was growing, and so was the state's determination to stop it. In 1973, the apartheid government moved. It issued banning orders against virtually the entire leadership of SASO and the Black community programs in a single sweep. Biko was banned and confined to King Williamstown. Pityana was banned. Seths Cooper, Strini, Mudley, and Harry Nengwinkulu we will get to next. The movement's leadership was scattered across the country, each person confined to their own home area, prohibitive with communicating with each other. So remember, banned people couldn't talk to each other, from speaking in public, from being quoted. Between 1973 and 1978, Pityana was subject to a series of detentions and banning orders. He completed his BA and law degrees through UNISA, studying by correspondence, which while under restriction. In 1976, he qualified with a B.Proc law degree. The apartheid government then barred him from practicing law in Port Elizabeth. He had spent years working towards a professional qualification, and the state simply refused to allow him to use it. In August 1977, on the 15th, his last conversation with Biko, Pityana was working as a candidate lawyer at a law firm in Port Elizabeth. He and Biko spoke by phone for an hour, not about politics, about a domestic situation Biko needed support on. Family matters. He had written about the phone call as the last ordinary moment before everything changed. The moment he hung up, security police arrived at his office. He was detained and locked up at the Barkin Street Police Station under Section 6 of the Terrorism Act without any stated reason. They used and abused that Section 6, did they not? Weeks later, in his cell, Pityana read in a newspaper that Steve Biko was dead. He had written about that moment, the shock and grief of reading in a newspaper, in prison, that his close comrade and the person who had most shaped his political life was gone. Biko had been beaten to death in police custody. Pityana was released in 1978, exhausted after a year in detention. He made a decision that many of his contemporaries had already made or would soon make. He went into exile. Such a hard decision. In 1978, Barney Pityana left South Africa with his wife and child and went to England. He had been banned, detained, and had watched his closest friend, murdered by the state. He was 32 years old, and he was starting over. The path he chose in exile tells you a great deal about who he is. He could have become primarily a political exile, joining the ANC in Lusaka, working through the liberation movement's external structure, doing the work of an activist in diaspora. Some of his contemporaries chose that path. Instead, he went deeper into something that had been central to his life since Lovedale and Fort Hare. He enrolled at King's College London to study theology. He completed an honours degree in 1981. He then trained for ordination in the Anglican ministry at Ripon College, Cuddesdon in Oxford. It was a mouthful. One of the Church of England's most respected theological colleges. He was ordained. He served as a curate at Milton Keynes and then as a vicar in Birmingham. This is something worth pausing on here. Barney Pityana was a man who had spent his 20s building a movement premised on the idea that Black people needed to liberate themselves through their own agency. He had been expelled from 2 universities for saying so. He had been banned, detained, and forced into exile. And now he was becoming a priest in the Church of England. This is not a contradiction. It is consistency. What Pityana had always been drawn to from the university Christian movement at Fort Hare, through Black consciousness, through his theological studies, was the question of what human dignity actually demand. What does it mean to be fully human? What structures and systems honor that humanity and which ones destroy it? Black consciousness answered those questions in political and psychological terms. Black theology answered them in spiritual and ethical terms. For Pityana, they were the same question. Black theology, of which Pityana became one of the leading South African exponents, argued that the God of the Bible is a God of liberation, that the gospel has something specific to say about oppression, about poverty, about what it means to be denied your humanity by a political system, that Christian faith is not a passive, otherworldly affair, but a call to active engagement with the injustices of the world. He was building on a tradition from American theologian James Cone through the liberation theologians in Latin America and bringing it to bear on the specific devastating reality of apartheid South Africa. In 1980, still in exile, he helped found Black consciousness movement of Azania, the BCMA. But his most consequential international role came in 1988, when he was appointed the director of the program to combat racism at the World Council of Churches in Geneva. He held that position until 1992. The Council of Churches was, throughout the apartheid era, one of the most important international institutions supporting the anti-apartheid struggle. Its special fund to combat racism had channeled money to liberation movements and organizations across Southern Africa, provoking fierce controversy in Western churches, especially in Britain, where many members objected to the idea the Christian body was funding organizations that used violence. Pityana navigated those debates from the inside at the highest level for 4 years. He also remained engaged in South African politics in exile, connecting with the ANC's religious structures and working through the complex relationship between the different strands of anti-apartheid opposition. In a 1997 interview with the Nordic Africa Institute, he reflected frankly on the tensions and the nuances, the funding politics, the ideological differences, the questions of how movements that had started from different places could work together towards the same end. By 1992, apartheid was ending. Negotiations between the ANC and the National Party were underway. Barney Pityana began to think about coming home. In 1993, he returned to South Africa. He had been gone for 15 years. The country he came back to was not the country he had left. It was on the verge of becoming, at least legally, a democracy. Nelson Mandela would be elected president the following year. The apartheid system that had expelled him from 2 universities, banned him, imprisoned him, and killed his closest friend was being dismantled. He did not come back to rest on his history. He enrolled at the University of Cape Town and completed a PhD in religious studies in 1995. He was admitted as an attorney of the High Court of South Africa in February 1996. He was in his 50s. The apartheid state had spent decades trying to prevent him from obtaining. In 1995, he was appointed to the newly established South African Human Rights Commission. The same year, he was elected its chair, a position he held until 2001. The Human Rights Commission was one of the new constitutional bodies created specifically to hold the post-apartheid state accountable, to investigate violations, and to embed human rights not just in law, but in the practice of governance. For a man who had spent his entire life arguing that Black lives had inherent dignity and worth, this was not an abstract administrative role. It was a continuation of everything he had ever done in a new institutional form. His work in human rights drew international recognition. In 2002, he was awarded an honorable mention of UNESCO Prize for Human Rights Education, a United Nations award recognizing outstanding contributions to the promotion of human rights worldwide. The same year, he was appointed a Fellow of King's College London, the institution where he had studied in exile, now formally recognizing him as one of its own. In November 2001, Barney Pityana was inaugurated as Vice-Chancellor and the Principal of the University of South Africa. He was the first Black person to hold this position. UNISA is one of the largest distance learning universities in the world, with hundreds of thousands of students across South Africa and beyond. For a man who had completed his own undergraduate and law degrees through UNISA by correspondence while banned and in exile, there is a particular resonance of this. He held the Vice-Chancellor role for 9 years until 2010. He then served as Rector of the College of Transfiguration, the Anglican Theological College in Grahamstown from 2011 to 2014. He became President of Convocation of the University of Cape Town. He never became politically quiet. In 2008, following the resignation of Thabo Mbeki, engineered by Jacob Zuma's faction within the ANC, Pityana was among the group of prominent former ANC figures who broke away to form the Congress of the People COPE. He had looked at what the ANC was becoming under Zuma and concluded, as he had concluded with NUSAS in 1967, that the institution was no longer serving its stated purpose. He had been consistently vocal about the Zuma years, calling publicly for the president's resignation and maintaining links with grassroots movements pushing for accountability. There's the through line here that runs from the boy expelled from Lovedale in 1963 for pushing back against Bantu Education, to the man calling out state capture and corruption 6 decades later. He has never been able to watch injustice without saying something about it. It appears to be a congenital condition. In his late 70s, he was appointed by the cabinet under President Cyril Ramaphosa to chair the National Lotteries Commission, an institution responsible for distributing billions of rands to civil society organizations across the country. The appointment drew some controversy, as the NLC had faced significant governance challenges. Pityana characteristically took the job anyway. The work Biko and Pityana started together in 1968 was never completed by the end of apartheid. Formal democracy arrived. The psychological liberation they had argued for, the full reclamation of dignity, the dismantling of internalized inferiority, the building of genuine human institution, that is a long project. It was not finished in 94, and it is not finished now. Barney Pityana is still here, still thinking, still speaking, the second pillar of a movement that changed South Africa, and a man who spent his life insisting in everything he did and everywhere he went that human dignity is not negotiable. He takes the responsibility I feel from having read and gone through this. That ongoing responsibility, he feels it deep because he hasn't stopped at any stage. Thank you so much for your service, for fighting for South Africans, for fighting for human rights, and being a leader that we could be proud of. Thank you, everybody, for listening. Next week, I'll be back, so you know what to do. Thank you. Bye.